Hey folks, back again for another, wow, I almost said Gravity Falls, another Over the Garden Wall vlog. This is episodes 3 and 4, which I think have really kind of solidified for me where I think this series is going. So let's jump in and start with talking about episode 3, Schoolhouse Follies, I think it was called. So one thing I didn't comment on in the first two episodes was that there's a real old school vibe to this show. Setting aside all the fairy tale stuff, there's a real kind of classic movie era kind of cartoon, dating back to when cartoons were a thing that were shown at the movies prior to the main feature. 20s, 30s, 40s, that kind of era. And earlier, even. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And that was really, I had wanted to mention, for example, that that Enoch in the second episode, the way he moved, the way he laughed, reminded me very much of the way characters would move in old Felix the Cat cartoons, for example. But then, in the third episode, it's even more of that vibe. The art style there, the animals in kind of rustic farm outfits from the American frontier days, that felt very much in keeping with the style of Disney's old Silly Symphonies, or early Merry Melodies, or cartoons of that type. Felix Cat again, lesser extent there. That was a little more urban in its settings. But yeah, very much the Silly Symphony, Merry Melody kind of thing, with farm animals dressed up as farmers, dancing and playing music. The style of the musical numbers, where they were a little bit slow, kind of weird. The one-room schoolhouse setting, that all felt very much like that. At the same time, the design of the animals, something about them felt very Beatrix Potter. They were drawn a little more naturalistically and less cartoony than animals in clothes normally are. It felt more like the illustrations from a Beatrix Potter book. Either way, it was a good episode. Very kind of random. I was a little uncomfortable with the gorilla. The gorilla looked a little bit like racist caricatures of black people from that era of cartoons, which is very unfortunate, and I'm kind of side-eyeing that decision pretty hard. Especially given the only other character who looks like they might be a person of color in these 4 episodes so far was the Highwayman. So that's a little bit unfortunate. More than a little bit. But that aside, it was a cute little story. Definitely very weird. And reaching more for the Beatrix Potter style of fairy tale, and even more so that Silly Symphony aesthetic. And I think really that's where this show is going, is it's kind of hybridizing that kind of very old-fashioned cartoon with fairy tales. Which makes a lot of sense because in some ways there's kind of this argument that mass entertainment took over fairy tales. Not just in terms of how, like, for many people, the Disney versions are the most familiar versions of all the fairy tales that Disney has covered, you know? But beyond that, the reason the Disney versions are the most familiar is because we don't sit around telling each other stories for entertainment anymore. You know, people used to do that. People used to, you know, either someone would be professionally a storyteller, and that would be their role in their community, or just somebody would be well known as a good storyteller, or people would just sit around and everybody would tell a story. And people shared stories together. They shared music together. You know, folk tales, folk music. The reason they're called that is because they were created and shared by folk, by, you know, regular people who needed something to do on long winter nights. And the narrative goes, the theory goes, that with the rise of mass culture, of pop culture, that kind of swept away folk culture. Because even if your local storyteller was good at storytelling, he couldn't compete with what was being shown on the movie screens, what was coming across the radio. You and your friends getting together to jam on, you know, crude homemade musical instruments couldn't compete with the professional symphony orchestra on the radio. And the rise of TV just killed it off completely. And folk culture shriveled up and died. I don't think that's entirely true. I think folk culture got pushed back to the fringes. I think it shriveled a bit. I think it shifted and transformed. I think it's still alive. But pop culture did emerge, and it did take over a lot of territory, and some people believe that it essentially colonized, conquered, and destroyed folk culture. So here we have, you know, the Disneyfication of fairy tales being taken in a different direction. What if we instead grimify early Disney? You know, take the stories and characters and motifs of the darker vein of German fairy tale. And I'm using German in a broad sense. I mean, you know, Northern European, British, German, whatever. Fairy tale, you know, the Brothers Grimm type of thing, and apply that to something that visually resembles, has a similar sense of humor to silly symphonies. It's an interesting approach. But then what I find even more interesting is that in episode 4 they're already interrogating that. Because what we have in episode 4 is, you know, we still have some classic cartoon references. The Highwayman does what is clearly an homage to the kind of stuff that Cab Calloway used to do on old cartoons. That kind of jazz singing number. And I think you could make a pretty strong case for the Tavern Keeper as being a version of Betty Boop. You know, I bet if you took that bonnet off, she'd look quite a bit like Betty Boop. And certainly her voice when she's singing, the way she suddenly pops into a higher pitch and then back down, that's very Betty Boop. So, but at the same time, you've got them kind of questioning Ward, who are you? And they don't accept his name as an answer. They want to know what role he plays. And they're searching for a role to jam him into. You know, at first they think he's the young lover, but then they reject that and label him as the pilgrim. which, you know, is exactly what I was doing with talking about the Greg as various versions of the Fool, and the Woodsman and Beatrice as guides met along the way, and that kind of thing. It's, our immediate response to encountering a story is to try to jam it in a box. And that is an instinct that is worth exploring, but can be explored too far. It should be resisted as well. Or else you start erasing the characters and replacing them with their roles. Wart disappears into the Pilgrim. And that's kind of what's happening at the end of the episode, is Wart tries to become someone he's not. He tries to be the Pilgrim. But in the end, he gets it wrong. By becoming the Pilgrim and challenging what he thinks is the Beast, he ends up basically making an enemy of someone who could have been an ally, someone who battles the Beast. Which I like that the Beast is shown only in shadow. He looks interesting. I can't tell if those are branches on his head or antlers. Either way, he's pretty clearly kind of this forest god. This is me putting people into boxes again, but he's reminiscent of the Erlking, which is another Germanic legend of a guy who steals lost children and takes them into his realm. Erlking means elf king. Takes them into his realm and keeps them. Here, I guess he turns people into trees, Edelwood trees, which is interesting. I'll have to double check, but I believe Edel, like Edel, Edel, means something to do with memory. I'll have to double check that though. And the lantern contains the soul of the woodsman's daughter or something like that. That's why he has to keep it lit. And apparently it's the dark lantern of the Beast. So, yeah, a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of stuff being revealed here. Fred looks like he's going to be a new character. And again, seems to be a theme we have going here, is none of these characters like each other, except Greg, who's too much of a fool to recognize that none of the other characters like him, and he likes everybody. But, Beatrice doesn't seem to like Fred. Wart and Beatrice don't like each other. Wart gets annoyed by Greg. Though, there it's, the annoying younger sibling thing for him, I think. It's not really a dislike. But a lot of tension in this little group. A lot of not getting along. Which is good. It helps keep things interesting. There can be entertainment value in a well-oiled team. There's some spectacular moments like that in the Avatar series. Both of them. But at the same time, there's value to be had in a team that doesn't get along. Gives you lots of ways for characters to interact. Which is fun. But yeah, we seem to be dealing with very much a Grimmification. Not in terms of like Grimdark or whatever, but like Brothers Grimm. Of kind of a Silly Symphonies, early cartoons aesthetic. Which is awesome. And at the same time, not being afraid to kind of critique some of the elements of that, which, it is a thing. Characters in fairy tales tend to be very generic. Oftentimes they don't even have names, they're just roles. The youngest son, the fool who doesn't know what fear is, the young lover, the pilgrim, the woodsman. These oftentimes that's all you get. You don't get a name. So that seems to be something that they might be intending to explore. It's possible that one of the senses in which they are lost is that they have lost themselves and need to find themselves, need to figure out who they are before they can figure out where they're going. Which is, usually, first you have to figure out who you are, and then what you want, and from there, where to go. Because right from the beginning of the first episode, Wart seemed a little bit ambivalent about wanting to go home. So maybe that's a thing. Maybe they need to discover what they truly want and where home is before they can go there. Either way, still really enjoying this. Looking forward to watching some more. I mean, this is my last episode for tonight, but definitely going to be watching more soon, and we'll be recording a vlog. So I think that's about it. So see y'all then. Bye.